December 6, 1991, in the quiet hours after closing time, something unthinkable would happen at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop in Austin, Texas. A crime so brutal it would haunt the city for decades. At the yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane, two teenage employees, Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison, both aged 17, were finishing up their shift. Waiting for them were Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Harbison, aged 15, and Sarah's friend, 13-year-old Amy Ayers, who had come by the shop for a ride home. Around midnight, a patrol officer reported a fire at the yogurt shop. Firefighters rushed in and what they uncovered was horrifying. The four girls had been bound, gagged and shot execution style in the head, and left amid a fire that was intentionally set. Arson meant to destroy evidence. 3 of the bodies were badly burned. Amy was shot twice, and had not been as extensively burned as the others, but her injuries were still very severe. Investigators later determined that at least one of the victims had been sexually assaulted, and that there were 2 different calibers of gun, a .22 and a .380, were used in the killings. The attack appeared meticulously planned. They had control of the victims, used multiple weapons, and they destroyed evidence. By the time the flames were out, so much of the physical evidence had been lost or damaged. The community was shaken, investigators scrambled for leads, and so many questions were left unanswered. Who would carry out such a crime, and would justice ever be served? In the aftermath of the horrific discovery at the yogurt shop, Austin police launched one of the biggest investigations in the city's history. Detectives chased down hundreds of tips, but the trail was frustratingly thin. Witnesses recalled seeing 2 suspicious men inside the shop shortly before closing time. One described as carrying a bag, a possible clue that weapons had been smuggled inside. Investigators also considered robbery as a motive, since money was missing from the register. But the sheer brutality suggested something far, far darker. Forensic evidence was limited, much of it destroyed by fire, but DNA from one of the victims pointed to an unidentified male. As the days turned into weeks, rumours swelled and the community grew restless. The pressure to solve the case was intensified, and over the years, detectives began looking closely at young men in the area who had criminal records or were rumoured to brag about involvement. Several suspects emerged, including Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, who were teenagers at the time of the murders. Both would eventually confess years later, but their statements raised many questions, filled with inconsistencies, missing crucial details, and allegedly obtained under intense police interrogation. Nearly a decade after the horrific yogurt shop murders, police believed they finally had their suspects. Their accounts didn't match and the key facts conflicted with the physical evidence. Despite this, prosecutors pressed forward. With no physical evidence tying them to the crime scene, doubts lingered. And still, the shadow of the yogurt shop murders weighed heavily on the people of Austin, and investigators were determined to bring someone to justice. What no one realised at the time was that the case would drag on for decades, marked by false leads, overturned convictions, and heartbreaking setbacks. In 2001, Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death, while Scott was convicted in 2002 and given life in prison. The convictions brought temporary relief to a community desperate for justice, but controversy surrounded the trials. The confessions were the backbone of the prosecution's case, yet they had been obtained after long, grueling sessions that many argued bordered on coercion. No DNA evidence tied either man to the crime scene, and the supposed corroboration came from only the suspect's own inconsistent words. Still, the jury believed them guilty, and for a time Austin thought the nightmare was over. But this was far from the end. Appeals would soon unravel the prosecution's case, casting new doubt on whether the true killers had been caught. Just when it seemed the yogurt shop murders had been solved, the justice system turned upside down. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Robert Springsteen's conviction, ruling that his constitutional rights had been violated because parts of Michael Scott's confession were used against him, even though Scott never testified in court. 3 years later, in 2009, Michael Scott's conviction was also reversed on the same grounds. Suddenly, the 2 men who were once branded as cold-blooded killers were free, while prosecutors scrambled to figure out what went wrong. Adding fuel to the fire, advancements in DNA testing revealed that genetic material found on one of the victims did not match either Springsteen or Scott. That revelation raised haunting questions. If not them, then who? Families of the victims were devastated, facing the prospect that nearly 2 decades of trials, appeals, and waiting had led only back to square one. Detectives publicly insisted that Springsteen and Scott were still their prime suspects, but without DNA evidence or reliable confessions, their case had collapsed. The real killer or killers may have never been caught and might still be out there. Decades after the tragedy, the yogurt shop murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved cases in Texas history until modern forensic science brought new answers. In the 2010s and 2020s, investigators began applying advanced techniques like YSTR testing and genetic genealogy, which can trace DNA through family lines. In 2025, these methods finally proved a breakthrough. The DNA from the crime scene was linked to Robert Eugene Brashers, a man already known as a violent serial offender. Brashers had died by suicide in 1999 during a standoff with police, but records revealed his history of sexual assault, armed robbery, and murder stretched far across multiple states. The revelation suggested that he had likely acted alone or with an unidentified accomplice. So who was Robert Eugene Brashers? Robert was a man who lived a double life. To neighbours he seemed like a quiet family man, but behind closed doors he was a predator responsible for a string of violent crimes across the US. Born in 1958, Brashers grew up in a horrible home environment, and by adulthood he had already developed a troubling criminal record. He was known to carry multiple weapons, travel frequently, and use other names to avoid detection. In 1990, he brutally attacked a woman in Missouri, nearly killing her, and he was sentenced to prison for assault. But after his release, instead of disappearing into obscurity, Brashers escalated his violence. He was connected to the sexual assault of young girls, home invasions, and multiple murders throughout the South and Midwest. His crimes were calculated and predatory. He often stalked his victims, struck at night, and left behind little evidence that could tie him directly to the scene. Law enforcement in several states tried to piece together the pattern, but Brashers was always one step ahead, moving across jurisdictions and hiding under false identities. His ability to evade capture earned him the nickname the Boogeyman among investigators who suspected him of more crimes than they could prove at the time. After his release from prison in the early 1990s, Robert's crimes grew darker and more violent. In 1997, he brutally murdered a mother and her 12-year-old daughter in Missouri, breaking into their home in the middle of the night. The attack was so violent and calculated that investigators immediately suspected that they were dealing with a seasoned predator. Just 2 years later, in 1999, Robert struck again in South Carolina, killing another woman in her own home. He was a chameleon, blending into communities under false names, sometimes posing as a travelling worker, other times keeping such a low profile that even neighbours had hardly noticed him. Robert also targeted young girls in sexual assaults. Each crime carried his signature ruthlessness, forced entry, domination, and cold execution. Yet for years, law enforcement had no idea the same man was behind all of the crimes. Robert's ability to cross state lines and change his identity made him incredibly difficult to track, and although investigators had gathered fragments of DNA from some crime scenes, the technology of the time couldn't connect the dots. He seemed unstoppable, a predator who slipped through the cracks of the system again and again. By 1999, Robert's violent streak was catching up to him. Law enforcement finally closed in. In April of that year, police tracked him to Gannett, Missouri, where he was living under a false name. Officers surrounded his home. Robert realized that the walls were closing in. Rather than face justice for his long trail of crimes, including rape, home invasion, and murders, he barricaded himself inside and opened fire on the police. A tense standoff unfolded, ending where Robert turned a gun on himself and took his own life at the age of 40. His death closed the case on a dangerous fugitive, but it also left behind more questions than answers. For years afterward, investigators knew that Robert had likely committed far more crimes than they could prove. But without DNA advancements, they were stuck with circumstantial evidence. Families of victims were left with no closure, and Robert's name faded into obscurity until decades later, when modern forensic genealogy techniques finally uncovered the full extent of his violence. His DNA linked him to unsolved cases across multiple states, including the shocking revelation in 2025 that he was the man behind the Austin yogurt shop murders. One of the most haunting cold cases. Robert lived and died as a shadow, a predator who hid in plain sight, destroying lives while wearing the mask of an ordinary man. For decades, he slipped through the cracks of the justice system, leaving behind shattered families, unanswered questions, and trails of violence. His suicide in 1999 seemed to seal his secrets forever, denying victims' families the chance to face him in court. But in the years that followed, science caught up. Forensic genealogy and advanced DNA testing finally exposed the truth. He was a serial predator, responsible for many rapes and murders, forever changing the narrative that had once centered on false confessions and overturned convictions. For the victims' families, Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer and Sarah Harbison, the news brought bittersweet closure. The pain of decades of uncertainty, wrongful prosecutions, and unanswered questions could never be fully erased. But at last, the shadows that had haunted Austin were beginning to lift. The yogurt shop murders had gone unsolved for more than 30 years. As we close the chapter on the yogurt shop murders, one of the darkest and most haunting cases in Texas history, it's important to remember that there are countless other unsolved or infamous crimes that beg for answers. From the chilling story of the Colonial Parkway murders in Virginia, where couples were found dead along deserted roads, to the terrifying case of the Springfield Three, three women who vanished without a trace from their Missouri home in 1992. There's also the disturbing tale of the West Memphis Three, where teenagers were convicted and later released after years of doubt. The list of mysteries is endless. Even cases like the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders of 1997. There are so many cases to cover. If any of the ones I have mentioned interest you, let me know in the comments below and I will get straight on it. Each of those cases, like the yogurt shop murders, carries its own legacy of tragedy, so many unanswered questions, and families waiting for justice.